In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at the main entries in control accounts. To score well in control account questions, you'll need to be familiar with these entries so that you know how to perform the adjustments that you will be given in the exam question. We'll start off by taking a look at debtors. And let's remind ourselves what the double entry rules for debtors will be. It's an asset account, and therefore everything on the debit side is going to increase or add to the balance. And everything on the credit side is going to reduce or minus from the balance. So let's keep that in mind as we go through. First thing we'll have is an opening balance. Being an asset account, we would expect that balance to be on the debit side. But in control account questions in the exam, you'll usually be given two balances. You'll be given the normal one, the big one, on the debit side. What you'll find for debtors control accounts is you'll be given usually a small balance on the credit side as well. This can arise, for example, in a situation where a debtor has paid us for goods that we've sent to them. They then send the goods back, sales returns, and we therefore owe them a refund, hence giving rise to a small balance on the credit side. Next one we're going to take a look at is sales on credit. Obviously this will increase the amount the debtors owe us, so it's on the debit side. Some of those goods will come back to us because customers return the goods, sales returns or returns in. That will reduce the amount owed, so it'll be on the credit side. Next one we're going to look at is discount allowed. We'll grant discounts or allow discounts to customers in situations to incentivize them to pay early. So we'll usually set a time period on the invoice. If they pay within that time frame, we'll usually offer them a discount. It's going to reduce the amount the debtor owes us, so it'll be on the credit side. You can have a situation as well, and it does come up in the exam, where you subsequently disallow those discounts. That'll happen, for example, where you thought the customer was going to pay on time, they told you they were, and then they didn't. They paid you late. So you'll have given them the discount only then to take it back off them or disallow it. So you're adding it back, therefore it's on the debit side. The next two are pretty simple. Customers who've bought goods from us on credit, our debtors, do need to pay us the money. They'll pay us in two ways, typically, usually cash or checks. Those two amounts, cash and checks, will obviously reduce the amount owed, so they'll be on the credit side. A less common form of payment are known as bills receivable. Similar to checks, the debtor will issue bills receivable, and that will obviously reduce the amount owed, and so it'll be on the credit side. Interesting thing about checks and bills receivable is that they can both be dishonored. So the reason we have these two entries here is reflecting situations where we get a check from a customer only to lodge it to our bank and the bank to tell us that customer didn't have enough money in the account to cover that check. And the same thing can happen with bills receivable. So both can be dishonored. And what that means is that the check or the bill receivable doesn't have the funds to back it up in the customer's account. So the check or the bill receivable in that case is effectively worthless. We've got to cancel that payment and therefore add it back to the balance or debit it to the debtor's control account. We spoke earlier about having a situation where we'll allow a customer a discount for paying us early. Discounts allowed. Typically, if customer pays late, after the payment period stipulated on the invoice, and that would usually be, say, something like 30 days. If a customer pays us beyond that period, we will charge them interest. So in addition to the amount they owe us for the sale, we will charge them interest at a given rate, and it'll be specified on the invoice. So that's going to increase further the amount those debtors owe us. So interest charged on overdue accounts will be debited to our control account. Next one to look at here is carriage charge to customers. What is that? Bit of an old-fashioned term. All it means is that we have charged the customer to deliver or transport the goods to them. So carriage charge to customers is an additional charge. So it's going to increase the amount the customer owes us or the debtor owes us. So it'll be on the debit side of the control account. Next one we look at is bad debts. So we can have a situation where a customer will go bankrupt or run into financial difficulties and tell us that they're not able to pay us in the money that they owe us. So typically in a bankruptcy situation, the money's gone, the debtor doesn't have the money to pay us, so we'll have to write off the bad debt. Basically saying that debt is worthless, so it's got to come off our balance. Therefore, it's a entry on the credit side, bad debt's written off, it'll reduce the amount owed. Next one, an important one, comes up in both debtors and creditors, is what's known as a contra entry. A contra entry, or a transfer to the creditor's ledger, is simply where we set off an amount owed by a debtor who also is somebody that we owe money to as a creditor. So this is a situation where we have a customer who buys goods from us, but is also somebody who is the supplier of ours or a creditor of ours. So we will typically owe money to them and they might owe money to us, and we can agree with that customer, who's also a supplier, to set off those balances. And that is what's called a contra entry. We'll simply take the amount that they owe us and say, you know what, instead of paying you, we'll not pay you that bit, and then we'll not owe you the equivalent amount that we owe you as a creditor. So in debtors control accounts, contra entries will reduce the amount owed, and therefore they will be on the credit side of the account. Now, before you work out the closing balance in the exam question for control accounts, it's important to remember that if you've been given a wrong side or a small balance on that credit side, opening balance, you need to remember to hold on to that. It was on the credit side here, so it'll be on the credit side at the bottom, and therefore the equivalent balance CD will be over here. That small closing balance. So that's that amount that you saw up here. The main closing balance, which you'll typically be working out, having made all your adjustments, will obviously be CD carried down on the credit side and brought down on the debit side as your new opening balance for the next accounting period. That's all of the main entries that we typically see in debtors' control accounts. Next up, we're going to look at creditors' control accounts. So with creditors' control accounts, we're talking about a liability account. So creditors' control accounts will follow the rules, the double entry rules, for liability accounts. So the debit side in this case will result in a reduction or minus from the balance. And if we want to increase or add to it, it'll be on the credit side. Let's again keep that in mind as we go through the adjustments. It being a liability account, we'd expect to see the opening balance on the credit side. That's where the big balance will be. But just like with debtors' control accounts in the exam question, creditors' control accounts will typically also throw up a small opening balance on the wrong side. So the wrong side for a creditor's control account is obviously the debit side. And again, if you think back to the previous example with debtors, this can arise other way around for us obviously this time. So we purchased goods on credit from a creditor, made the payment, and then returned them. So we're owed a refund, so the creditor actually owes us money. So that's how you can end up with a small balance on the debit side of a creditor's control account. When we purchase goods on credit, that'll obviously increase the amount we owe to our creditors, so it'll be on the credit side of the account. If we return some of those goods, returns outwards or purchase returns, that will reduce the amount owed, it'll be on the debit side. In cases where we pay our creditors the money we owe them within the early payment period, they will typically give us a discount. So we will receive a discount. Discounts received from our creditors, which reduce the amounts owed to those creditors, so it'll be on the debit side. We can have situations as well where, having received the discount, our payment for whatever reason ended up being late. So check ended up being late, maybe even dishonored. In that case, the discount is disallowed or added back by the creditor, so it must go on the credit side. The next three I've highlighted here are all forms of payment. So we owe money to our creditors, we must pay them that money. We can pay them in the form of cash, therefore reducing the amount owed, debit side. We can pay them by check, drawn on our bank, debit side entry, reducing the amount owed. And we can also issue what are known as bills payable. So they're just like the bills receivable that you saw on the debtors, so we are issuing them. They would be recorded as bills payable accepted, therefore reducing the amount owed. So all three of those will reduce the amount owed. They'll be on the debit side of the creditor's control account. As checks and bills payable are both forms of payment, but they're future payment, if you like, because they have to be presented to the bank. So a check can be presented to the bank only for the bank to say, sorry, not enough money in that account to cover this amount. That can happen for both checks and bills payable. When that happens, they are said to be dishonored by the bank. So in that case, the check and the bill payable is no longer worth the paper it's written on, so the balance must be added back or credited to the creditor's control account. Next one is carriage charged by suppliers. Well, it's just like the carriage we saw in the debtor's account, except this time around, the creditor is charging us, and they're charging us for typically transport of goods. That's what carriage means. So it's an additional charge. It adds to the balance or increases it. Therefore, it's on the credit side of the account. Next up is the contra entry. So here's the mirror image of the contra entry we saw in the debtor's control account. Here's the other half of that double entry. We owe money to our creditor, but they also happen to be a debtor of ours. So we owe them money, they owe us money. We agree to set those two off. We do what's called a contra entry. When doing your closing balances on the account, don't forget to include the opening balance, that little opening balance that we had, the wrong side opening balance. Remember that debit balance up here? So it'll be obviously CD on the credit side, BD on the debit side. And the main balance to be carried down will be on this side, debit side, and brought down on the credit side. That'll be the large balance. And you'll see when we come to do the exam questions, typically you'll be working this out. It'll be the plug figure, the little balance that we talked about, the one that we, this one on this side here, that we brought down a moment ago, we leave it as is because none of the adjustments have resolved it for us. So they're all the main entries that you'll see in a creditor's control account. Familiarizing yourself, as I said, both with debtors and creditor control account entries, really important for the exam. As always, there's detailed explanations of all this in your study notes. And there are also 2 self-test questions that I would recommend you do on your own time. Do the questions and then look at the solutions. It'll be a good test